The winch groaned as the cable kept feeding out, foot after foot, into water that had already swallowed every trace of daylight. On the monitors inside a control room built into a shipping container lashed to the deck, a small remotely operated vehicle kept falling, its lights carving a thin cone through blackness that had never once been broken by the sun. It hadn't been sent down here to find a lost ship or a sunken city or the wreckage of some vanished aircraft the old stories loved to talk about. It had been sent to answer a far more basic question, one the legend had somehow never gotten around to asking in nearly a century of retelling. What is actually down there? Not the myth. Not the ghost stories passed around at dinner tables and campfires for generations. The real seafloor, in the real dark, at the bottom of the most famous patch of ocean on Earth. And when the drone's lights finally found the bottom, what they revealed was stranger than any curse anyone had ever invented, just not in the way the legend had trained us to expect. For the better part of 100 years, this stretch of the Atlantic has carried a reputation that has almost nothing to do with the actual ocean underneath it. Draw a rough triangle on a map, one corner near Miami, one out at Bermuda, one down at Puerto Rico, and you've enclosed roughly 500,000 square miles of sea. Inside that triangle, according to the legend, ships vanish without explanation, planes drop off the radar mid-transmission, compasses spin uselessly, and entire crews disappear between one radio call and the next. It's one of the most durable myths of the last century, retold in books, documentaries, and late-night television specials for generations. And for all that retelling, the strangest thing about the Bermuda Triangle was never really the disappearances at all. It's what actually sits beneath it, in water so deep and so poorly mapped that we genuinely have better imagery of the surface of the moon than we do of large stretches of this seafloor. Set the legend aside for a moment, not because it isn't a good story, but because the reality underneath it turns out to be more interesting. This isn't shallow, gentle water. Along the eastern edge of the triangle, the ocean floor drops away into the Puerto Rico Trench, plunging to a depth of roughly 8,400 meters, more than 5 miles straight down and the deepest point anywhere in the Atlantic Ocean. If you drained that trench and stood at the bottom looking up, a cruising jet airliner would fit into the vertical gap between you and the surface several times over. The conditions down there aren't just inhospitable, they're lethal in a way that's genuinely hard to picture. At full depth, the water pressure amounts to hundreds of times what we experience at sea level, squeezing from every direction at once rather than pushing from a single side, a force that would collapse an unprotected human body faster than a nerve impulse could travel from skin to brain. The water hovers just above freezing. There's no light, no warmth, nothing but the occasional groan of shifting sediment and the endless, silent drift of particles falling from far above. The danger here is entirely real. It just isn't supernatural. Its depth, cold, and pressure, 3 of the oldest and most indifferent hazards the ocean has to offer, and it's worth pausing on just how unmapped this region genuinely is. We tend to imagine the ocean floor as thoroughly charted, as though a complete map of every ridge, canyon, and trench already sits filed away somewhere. It doesn't exist. The overwhelming majority of the world's seafloor has never been surveyed in meaningful detail, and huge sections of the bottom beneath the Bermuda Triangle have been crossed by surface vessels and glimpsed from orbit but never actually filmed, lit, or examined directly. Ridges no camera has ever resolved. Slopes no one has traced. It's one of the last genuine frontiers left on the planet, sitting not on some distant world but a short boat ride off a Florida beach where tourists sunbathe with no idea what falls away beneath them. The legend deserves to be told honestly before it gets set aside, because the stories themselves are genuinely haunting. There's the famous account of a flight of military aircraft that vanished during a routine training exercise, their final transmissions reportedly confused, their instruments apparently malfunctioning, the ocean giving nothing back. There are tales of merchant vessels found drifting and empty, meals left half-eaten, no sign of struggle anywhere aboard. There are the compass stories, the claim that in this one patch of ocean and nowhere else, the needle simply refuses to behave. Strung together in the right order, in a low enough voice, these stories build a picture of a hungry sea that swallows whatever crosses it. It's a genuinely compelling narrative, and it survived for generations because it's easy to feel in the gut. But when investigators and researchers actually sat down with the shipping and aviation records, the legend started to deflate in a fairly unglamorous way. This is one of the busiest, most heavily trafficked stretches of ocean anywhere in the world. Thousands of ships and aircraft cross it every year, threading between major ports along some of the oldest shipping and flight corridors in the hemisphere. When researchers compared the actual number of losses here against that enormous volume of traffic, the disappearance rate turned out to be no higher than in any other busy, storm-prone stretch of open sea. The Triangle isn't statistically hungrier than anywhere else. It only feels that way because generations of storytellers counted the losses and quietly forgot to count everything that made it through safely. There are ordinary, well-understood forces at work here that explain far more than any curse could. The Gulf Stream, for one, isn't a gentle current, it's a genuine river inside the ocean, warm, fast, and relentless, capable of dragging a disabled vessel miles from its last known position within a matter of hours. A boat that loses power near the eastern edge of the Triangle can be swept deep into the open Atlantic long before anyone realizes it's missing, and by the time a search begins, whatever debris field might have existed has already been scattered and carried far from where the loss actually occurred. The sea doesn't need to be haunted to hide its dead. It only needs to keep moving, and it never stops moving. Then there's the weather, which in this part of the world can turn with a speed that has genuinely caught experienced sailors off guard for as long as people have been navigating these waters. The warm water here feeds storm systems that can build from a calm, bright afternoon into a wall of wind and rain faster than a boat can reach a radio. Waterspouts spin up over the shallows. Squall lines can close distance faster than a small craft can outrun them. In the decades before satellite forecasting and modern navigation systems, a pilot or captain could sail directly into a developing system with essentially no warning at all, no way to see it coming, and no way to call for help once it hit. Add ordinary human error into that mix, a wrong heading, a fuel miscalculation, a moment of confusion when instruments and instinct disagree, and you have every ingredient needed for a loss that leaves nothing behind. Not a mystery. A tragedy, the ordinary kind, repeated across more than a century of heavy traffic and eventually gathered up and retold as a single sinister pattern. Even the famous compass stories mostly dissolve under a steady look. There are regions of the world's oceans where true north and magnetic north happen to align closely, meaning a compass points almost directly at the geographic pole without requiring the correction navigators normally have to apply. Parts of the Atlantic near this region have historically sat close to that alignment. A sailor who forgot to account for the usual magnetic deviation, or who expected a correction that this particular stretch of water simply didn't require, could easily conclude his instruments had failed when in fact they were behaving exactly as physics predicted. The needle wasn't cursed. It was doing its job, and any confusion sat with the person reading it rather than the instrument itself. So the honest picture that emerges is almost anticlimactic on the surface. There's no evidence of anything unnatural pulling ships and aircraft into the deep. The disappearances that genuinely happen have explanations that are individually mundane and collectively unremarkable for a sea this busy and, when it wants to be, this violent. And yet, setting the curse aside doesn't make this place less interesting. If anything, it makes it more interesting, because it turns a manufactured mystery into a real one. The genuine mystery was never happening on the surface, where the boats supposedly vanished. It was waiting below, on the seafloor, in the dark, in all that water nobody had ever actually looked at. The legend had been pointing at the wrong thing the entire time, keeping our attention fixed on the waves while the far stranger story sat underneath them, completely unexamined. Getting down to that true bottom isn't something a human body can survive, and that isn't dramatic exaggeration, it's simple physics. Water is heavy, and the deeper you descend, the more of it stacks up overhead, pressing in from every direction simultaneously. Near the surface, a trained diver can tolerate the pressure with the right equipment and preparation. But descend into the deep basins of this region, down toward the trench running along the triangle's eastern edge, and the load climbs into a range measured in hundreds of atmospheres, a force capable of folding steel and imploding a poorly built vessel in an instant, faster than the eye could register the failure. There's no holding your breath against that. There's no simply swimming down for a look. The water down there is also permanently black, sunlight scattered and absorbed within the first few hundred meters, leaving everything below in a darkness that has never once been interrupted by a natural dawn since the ocean first formed. The temperature hovers just above freezing, a steady, energy-sapping cold with no seasons and no relief. A person lowered into that environment would face death from crushing pressure, from cold, or simply from the impossibility of a safe return without an achingly slow, carefully managed descent. Only a small handful of vehicles on the entire planet have ever reached the deepest parts of the ocean floor, and each descent represents enormous cost and enormous risk, a single dive mounted and then hauled back to safety before the sea can claim it too. So instead, we build proxies. Machines that don't need to breathe, that don't fear the cold, that feel nothing resembling panic when the last trace of light disappears above them. We build hulls rated to withstand the crush, eyes engineered to see clearly in total darkness, and systems that stay perfectly steady at depths that would instantly kill anything alive and unprotected. Then we lower that machine on a cable while staying warm, dry, and safe on the surface, watching everything unfold through its eyes. That's the role this particular ROV was built to play, not a person sacrificed to the deep, but a robot sent in our place, tethered to a survey ship, wired into a room full of monitors, carrying human curiosity down into a place human bodies were simply never built to survive. And on the day it descended into water a century of legend had insisted was cursed. Nobody on that ship had any idea that what it eventually found would have nothing to do with ghosts and everything to do with the genuinely strange chemistry of the deep ocean itself. The vehicle itself looks less like a submarine and more like a floating workshop, a boxy titanium frame wrapped in syntactic foam, a specialized buoyant material engineered to hold its shape under crushing pressure without collapsing. Across its front sits a bank of powerful lights, and behind them, high-resolution cameras capable of capturing the seafloor in sharp, honest color the moment those lights hit it. Thrusters mounted at each corner allow it to hover, turn, and hold position against deep currents, while an onboard sonar system sketches the shape of the terrain out of sound alone, mapping what lies ahead before the lights can physically reach it. Articulated manipulator arms extend from the frame, capable of reaching out, closing around a rock or a handful of sediment, and tucking a sample into a collection basket to be hauled back up into daylight. Everything about the machine exists for a single purpose: to operate where no person safely can, and to bring back honest proof of what's actually there. The tether is the lifeline of the entire operation, a single armored cable running from a winch on deck all the way down into the black, carrying power in one direction and a steady stream of data in the other. It's thicker than a wrist and wound with steel, because the sheer weight of that much cable hanging into deep water is itself a mechanical strain the winch has to manage carefully, foot by foot. Everything the drone's cameras see travels back up that line into a control room where two pilots sit in padded chairs, hands on controllers that wouldn't look out of place attached to a video game console, except that these controllers are steering a machine falling through miles of open water toward a place no living human eye has ever directly seen. The moment the drone slipped beneath the surface, the water swallowed it almost instantly. On the main monitor, churning white bubbles gave way to bright turquoise, which slowly deepened into blue, then into a blue so dark it edged toward violet, the last stubborn threads of sunlight bending weakly through the water column. The depth counter climbed steadily. Around 200 meters, the pilots watched the last recognizable daylight drain out of frame entirely, the blue thinning to gray and the gray fading to nothing. By 1,000 meters, there was no sunlight left at all, and the drone had crossed into the part of the ocean that receives not a single photon from above, a permanent night that has existed unbroken for as long as there has been an ocean on this planet. From that point forward, the only light in the drone's entire world came from the lamps it carried with it, and into that narrow cone drifted what deep-sea researchers call marine snow, a slow, constant fall of pale organic particles sinking from the sunlit waters far above, the accumulated debris of everything that lives near the surface and eventually dies and drifts downward. It fell through the beam like snowfall with no wind, silent and unhurried, the same quiet process that has been feeding the deep ocean for millions of years. The depth counter kept climbing, 2,000 meters, 3,000, the temperature outside the hull holding steady just above freezing, the pressure readout ticking upward with every additional 100 meters of descent. Past 3,000 meters, the pilots ran a routine systems check, cycling each thruster, panning the cameras, testing the manipulator arms, confirming the machine was still whole and still responsive before continuing. Everything answered normally. The descent continued into a long stretch where there was genuinely nothing to see but falling particles and blackness beyond them. No landmarks, no walls, nothing but a steadily climbing depth counter and the quiet awareness that every meter descended was a meter that would eventually need to be climbed back if anything went wrong. 4,000 meters. 5,000. The drone was already deeper than the resting place of most of the world's most famous shipwrecks, and still the sonar showed nothing below but open water, a soft, empty field, each returning ping delayed by the sheer scale of water it had to travel through. Past 6,000 meters, the sonar display finally changed, a faint texture appearing along its lower edge, the first hint of solid ground where before there had only been void. The pilots leaned toward the screens. The machine was approaching the wall of the trench, the deepest scar cut into the entire Atlantic floor, and on the sonar it slowly built itself out of returning sound, a rising slope of rock and sediment climbing up out of the deep. The pilots eased back on the descent rate, feathering the thrusters to avoid blundering blindly into terrain they couldn't yet see with their eyes. The altitude readout, tracking height above the seafloor rather than depth below the surface, finally activated and began counting down, 50 meters, 40, the camera still showing nothing but falling marine snow, the actual bottom still hidden just beyond the reach of the lights. At the very edge of illumination, the falling particles seemed to gather and thicken, and a shape slowly resolved out of the darkness, low, uneven, pale mounds rising from the seafloor rather than anything resembling a wreck or ruin. As the drone crept closer, the pilots noticed the surface of these mounds wasn't still. Something faint and continuous was shimmering off the top of them, a thin, trembling distortion in the water, similar to heat rising off pavement on a hot afternoon. One pilot held the drone steady, hovering a few meters above the bottom, letting the cameras take in the scene. The depth reading placed them nearly a mile and a half beneath a stretch of ocean that a century of legend had insisted was cursed, unnatural, a place where the normal rules of the world simply stopped applying. And here, finally, was the actual seafloor. And here, rising from it, was something venting, shimmering, unmistakably active, and nothing about it resembled anything the legend had ever promised. What was rising from that seafloor turned out to be a mound of frozen gas. One of the pilots said the word quietly, almost to himself, hydrate. Deep in the cold, crushing pressure of the ocean floor, methane seeping upward through the sediment behaves very differently than gas released near the surface. Rather than bubbling freely away, the extreme cold and pressure lock it into a crystalline lattice of water ice, trapping methane molecules inside a structure known as gas hydrate, which slowly builds into pale, humped deposits resembling dirty snow packed into strange, fungal shapes. The shimmering the pilots had noticed was methane escaping through a crack in that icy structure, a thin, steady thread of gas rising through the black water and bending the drone's lights the way heat bends a view across hot pavement. It was genuinely beautiful in the way that only something no living person has ever stood beside can be, and it was also, in the end, entirely ordinary. That was the detail the pilots kept returning to as the drone drifted along the mound's ridges and hollows. There was no menace in it at all. There was chemistry, pressure, and cold, the same slow, patient machinery that operates at seep sites off the coasts of Oregon, Japan, and virtually every continental margin on Earth. The Bermuda Triangle had promised a curse and delivered. Instead, a formation of ice and gas that exists in oceans all over the planet. But the crew didn't stop there, and the deeper they looked, the stranger, in an entirely honest way, things became. The drone eased past the edge of the hydrate mound, and its lights swept across a shallow pool set directly into the seafloor sediment, rimmed with pale mineral crust and filled with water that shimmered differently from the ocean surrounding it, denser and oilier, catching the light the way a puddle does after rain. This was a brine pool, water so saturated with dissolved salt and minerals that it refuses to mix with the ocean above it, instead pooling on the seafloor like a small lake complete with its own shoreline. Crowded along that shoreline, thick as moss on a shaded wall, were dense mats of bacteria, feeding not on sunlight, since none has ever reached this depth, but on the chemical energy leaking directly out of the seafloor itself. This was a genuine, thriving ecosystem, not the barren emptiness people tend to imagine when picturing the deep sea, but a dense, functioning community built entirely on chemistry rather than light. Pale crabs moved across the bacterial mats. Clusters of tube worms swayed faintly in a current too weak for the drone's instruments to properly measure. Something long, pale, and translucent, a fish adapted to a world that has never known daylight, drifted briefly through the beam and vanished back into the dark. The pilots recorded all of it, not because any of it was secret or hidden, but because almost nobody had ever pointed a camera at this specific patch of seafloor before, sitting as it does beneath the single most famous stretch of supposedly cursed ocean on the planet, and remaining, even now, less thoroughly mapped than the visible surface of the moon. That's the quiet, genuinely staggering truth sitting underneath the entire legend. We've named this triangle. We've built an entire mythology around it, made it shorthand for the unexplained in books and films and 1,000 late-night broadcasts. And yet we've mapped only the thinnest possible sliver of what actually sits at the bottom of it. The mystery was never a curse dragging ships beneath the waves. The mystery was that almost nobody had ever actually looked. It's worth being honest about where the real, evidence-based science on methane and ship losses actually stands, because the mound the drone found isn't entirely without practical implications. Researchers have long explored a genuine, testable hypothesis that a sufficiently large, sudden release of seafloor methane could locally reduce the density of the water above it, and that a vessel positioned directly over such an eruption could, in theory, lose enough buoyancy to settle lower than normal, or that escaping gas could interfere with an engine or instrument reading. It's a real phenomenon rooted in real chemistry. But no documented case has ever demonstrated that this mechanism actually sank a specific vessel in this region, and the scientists who study these seeps are consistently careful to say so rather than overstate the connection. Still, a real, physically grounded mechanism worth studying honestly is a far more satisfying thing to sit with than vague talk of curses and vanishing needles. The truth, once you actually descend far enough to find it, doesn't need anything supernatural. The deep ocean itself is stranger, and more genuinely worth exploring, than anything storytellers ever needed to invent to fill the silence. Later in that same mission, on a separate pass across the trench floor, the drone's cameras did eventually pick out the crushed remains of a hull, half swallowed already by the slow, endless rain of falling sediment. There was nothing mysterious about it either. It sat exactly where the Gulf Stream, a violent night, and the kind of sudden storm that regularly rolls through these waters would be expected to carry a disabled vessel, the same ordinary forces responsible for losses in every busy, weather-beaten sea on the planet. When the disappearances connected to this region are counted honestly against the sheer volume of traffic crossing it every single year, they occur at no greater rate than anywhere else that combines heavy shipping with sudden, violent weather. This stretch of ocean isn't hungry. It's simply large, deep, busy, and for the most part, still completely unseen. The drone eventually climbed back to the surface that day, hauled up through 6,000 meters of black water on its tether while the pilots powered down the lights and watched the depth counter slowly unwind toward zero. The footage went onto a hard drive to be studied, catalogued, and eventually shared, and what it represented wasn't really the end of a mystery at all. It was closer to the beginning of one. Because for every hydrate mound, brine pool, and vent the cameras happened to find on that single mission, there remain thousands of square kilometers of that same trench floor that no camera, human-piloted or robotic, has ever crossed. There are trench walls that have never been imaged in detail, seeps that have never been sampled, entire sections of terrain that exist only as blank space on a chart. The real frontier here was never the ghost story built to explain it. It's the physical place itself, still dark, still almost entirely unmapped, still waiting for the next machine willing to make the long, cold descent and simply look.